For example, judo, we might think that, okay, this is just Japanese jiu-jitsu with the like hurtful techniques taken out, the dangerous technique taken out, but it is actually a far more deep and subtle transition that went from jiu-jitsu to judo. It is very cultural, it is very political, and it is very social and intellectual. It is not just on the technique level. For example, BJJ, the same thing. Maeda arrived in Brazil and met a very talented little boy called Carlos Gracie, and then Elio took the torch and continued on, and thus we have what is called BJJ, when the actuality, the story is far more deeper, far more detailed, and less romantic than it seems to be. So which brings me to this subject, Greco-Roman wrestling. I have said it multiple times, I love Greco-Roman wrestling. If I wasn't a judoka, I'd probably be a Greco-Roman wrestler. It is a beast of a martial art with an upright posture, very much like judo, the shizentai, and also control of the body, of the upper body in the street fight is all that matters. It's not that hunched over posture, it's not being on the ground all the time, but it is this starting with a very good posture and taking someone down and pinning them and really showing dominance. It is without submissions like chokes and locks, and it is without leg grabbing, and yet no one is saying it is underrepresented, but that's none of my business. So the name Greco-Roman wrestling, it might suggest that, oh, it is just the ancient form that they used to do, naked wrestling in Greece. We say immediately pancration, when in fact this is not pancration. Pancration, even it had its revival back in the 70s, and it had a lot of new martial arts added to it, like judo, Muay Thai, etc. by Jim Arvanitis. So even that has different origins. But when it comes to Greco-Roman wrestling, the idea is far different, because back then, we are talking 18th, 19th century, in all aspect, like art, martial arts, and even architecture, there was this very big trend of really reviving the old. Because, you know, back when I was in architecture school, there was I was studying the 19th century architecture, and there was what is called the after the Baroque and the Neoclassicism, etc., there was what is called the Neo-Gothic. So it was like a time for revival of all that is old, and martial art was not an exception. I always talk about this. Martial art are not an entity of its own. It is a part of society, the political climate, and what is happening, like political class, socio-economical, all of it. Martial art is there pretty much. So today we're gonna see a different story of how really Greco-Roman came to be. So this is according to United World Wrestling. I will leave the link in the description below for you to enjoy it. So we all know that Greco is like where you cannot grab the legs, you cannot use your legs to attack. Everything is from the waist up when it comes to defense and attack. Even on the ground, you cannot grab legs. So even far more restrictive than judo when it comes to the leg grabbing. So the idea goes, or the story goes, is that it is actually one of Napoleon's soldiers called Jean Exbrayat. He developed this style. He was going through doing fairs and also doing shows and demonstrations using this particular style. He called it at first lutte à plat main, meaning a flat hand wrestling, to separate it from the hand-to-hand combat that was going on back then, from catch and also the striking and a lot of the stuff like biting, etc. So in 1848, that was the first time that he really wrote an official rule set, and this one included that nothing below the waist should be held or touched with the legs or with the hands. Also, you cannot use any painful submissions or torsions that will injure or maim an opponent. So it was called back then flat hand wrestling, or French wrestling, and in my opinion the most logical way to call it is actually French wrestling, in my opinion. So we have the French kickboxing, which is savate, that was actually invented somewhat during the after the revolution, because crime rate has gone up, theft, etc. There was just chaos. So anytime you take out a regime, you're gonna have this small period, well, depending how small it is, period of a vacuum, a power vacuum, and it's gonna cause a lot of chaos on the ground. It's gonna be absolutely chaotic, and a lot of people are gonna suffer. So the savate, that's how savate was born. So this is a few decades after that. So we are still in the same area where France is still trying to repair itself. French wrestling was mostly done by Jean Exbrayat for economic reasons. So he was going in circuses, fairs, etc., and making a lot of money. So that was the trend, apparently. And then it was actually called French wrestling. So it became very popular in Europe. A lot of people started to train it, like Scandinavians, Italians, Greeks, etc. So then one day, one Italian wrestler called Basilio Bartoletti named it greco-roman wrestling, because he was so fond and interested in ancient history and ancient values. So as I mentioned, this was a time to really renovate, or really show the interest and value in stuff that are very much of the ancient world, like Roman Empire, the Neo-Gothic. Even in arts, in paintings, you would see a lot of the stuff that we're trying to go back to the chiaroscuro movement. I'm sorry, this is like a little bit different, but we have to understand that back then, especially the 19th century, there was this huge interest in order to really replicate or pay homage to everything that was of the antiquities. So martial arts, especially this. So it was kind of like a very romantic name to give it, Greco-Roman wrestling, kind of like when you love something old and then you name it back, you give it back the name. So it wasn't exactly Greco-Roman wrestling. So obviously there was some influence from Palais, which is actually the naked ancient Greek wrestling, which dates back to, I'd say, around 8,000 years old. Maybe I'll cover it in a video of its own, but that's mainly it. That's how the term and how the rules, etc. So it's obviously inspired by the ancient forms of wrestling, but this whole rules and all these throwing, etc., or this focus of throws is actually because of this one man, Jean Exbrayat, that made all this rule set, that wanted to distinguish itself from the striking and submissions and all the stuff that were in other forms of wrestling. So the British and the Americans were not very fond of this style, because they really liked freestyle wrestling. Maybe I'll cover the origins of freestyle in another video. So because they, keep in mind, British back then were very big on catch, the hooking, submission, painful cranks and submission holds, and also they were grabbing legs and throwing and shooting doubles. So obviously they're not going to be a big fan of the idea of not grabbing below the waist. So it wasn't that popular in Britain and America, but in France and all of Europe it was actually very popular. So there was this one man that served in the Franco-Prussian War by the name of William Malden, that trained Greco-Roman wrestling. He wanted to make it popular in Britain, but he somewhat failed, and also America after the Civil War. But he was very successful in Europe, as I mentioned earlier. So it was very popular, actually. Even the Russians, even before, like we say, the Soviets countries, they were very big. They're still very big on wrestling, etc. Even before that, even the Tsar would pay a lot of athletes to perform wrestling, Greco-Roman to be exact. So kind of like the sumo wrestlers and the daimyo that would be paid hefty sums of money in order to go out and perform and bring, glory to their daimyo. But here it was the Russian Tsar. So this is a very fun fact. The Greco-Roman wrestling was actually the first form of wrestling to be adopted into the Olympic Games since the very beginning. In 1896, the first Olympic Games in Athens, Greco-Roman wrestling was present. So it wasn't played during Paris in 1900 and St. Louis in 1904 when they added freestyle. So they gave freestyle a chance. But that's it. So if you think about it, just like any other martial art, like jiu-jitsu, judo, etc., the idea or the story is far more detailed and far less romantic. So this is something that really interests me, because it seems that this is a thing in martial art to really romanticize a story, even though the evidence are just all over the place, and yet we tend to choose the romantic version of the story. It just shows how I don't want to call us emotional beings, but we tend to gravitate towards those beautiful things because we tend to love these arts very much. You don't see someone that does martial arts, especially really dedicated and loves it, how do you say, mediocre, in a mediocre manner. You either see someone full on, or they're just like, okay, and then they end up leaving. So I think this is a reason why we tend to like or gravitate towards these romantic versions of these. I mean, even the idea, like the way they came up with the name was actually a very romantic thought, because it was paying homage to the olds. And, you know, back then, the whole of Europe was doing the same thing, was everything like architecture, clothing, art, and of course, wrestling. So if you have anything else to add, let me know down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon. I have exclusive content for the patrons only, and would really appreciate your support. Also, don't forget to check out Josh Simon's shop for historical t-shirts and historical articles. This was Shadi, and thank you for listening.